Welcome to our daily story. Please give me some feedback. If you've listened, don't forget to like and comment below. Megan walked into the sunny yard, carrying a basket full of white fabric. The morning was peaceful, only the sound of leaves rustling in the light breeze. Chirabi remained in the office as usual. Megan treasures peace, but lately it has become heavy, as if silence now brings loneliness. She knelt down to arrange the cloth into the basket, her hands moving instinctively. Suddenly, a strong wind suddenly blew in the yard, surprising her. The force blew up the hem of her dress, and Megan froze in shock, her face red with shame. She quickly grabbed the dress to push it back into place. When she looked up, she made eye contact with Nathan, Chirabi's stepson. He stood a few paces away, a startled look on his face, although there was something deeper, something searching in his eyes. "Nathan," Megan tried, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you need something?" Nathan hesitated, his hands a little fidgety. "No. I was just going out to get some air," he replied, his voice gentle. Megan nodded, not knowing what to say more. She returned to the basket and walked toward the house, but she couldn't escape the feeling of his eyes following her. Inside, she stopped by the sink, her thoughts racing. That brief moment seemed to energize her, although she couldn't explain why. Nathan's eyes, calm yet sharp, seemed to hold unspoken words, stirring something within her without her realizing it. Megan shook her head, dismissing the thought as absurd. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself. But deep inside she knew that moment had left a mark that she could not forget. That afternoon, Megan stood in the kitchen, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water as she washed dishes after lunch. The gurgling sound of the faucet is the only sound in the house. She found that monotony comforting, a way for her to forget any remaining thoughts about Nathan's eyes from earlier. Suddenly, she heard gentle footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn back to know who it was. "Do you need any assistance?" Nathan's voice was soft and calm, but still startled her. "No, Nathan," Megan replied quickly, eyes still on the plate in her hand. "I'm done." Nathan doesn't leave. She felt his presence, quietly but undeniable, as if the room itself had changed when he appeared. For a moment, the dripping sound of the taps seemed to grow louder, filling the silence between them. Finally Megan turned around, smiling politely at him. "Why don't you go outside? It's such a nice day." Nathan leaned lightly against the kitchen counter, folding his arms. "I like it better here. It's quieter." She didn't know how to answer. The way he looked at her, still and focused, made her feel exposed. Returning to the sink, she tried to concentrate on the task at hand, scrubbing the dishes harder than necessary. "Do you enjoy gardening?" asked Nathan, breaking the silence. Megan glanced at him, surprised at the question. "Yes. I know," she said cautiously. Nathan nodded, his lips curved into a small smile. "I noticed. The roses look so pretty." His words, though innocent, carried a weight that she couldn't ignore. Megan nodded, feeling her heart pound faster. "Thank you." As Nathan left the kitchen, Megan let out a shaky breath, realizing that she had been holding her breath the entire time. That afternoon, Megan knelt down in the garden, carefully pruning her roses. Sunlight filtered through the branches above, covering the bright flowers with golden streaks. Gardening has always been her solace, a way to calm her restless thoughts. But today, her mind refused to calm down. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being followed. Glancing up, she saw Nathan not too far away, washing the car. The water droplets sparkled in the sunlight as they slid down the glossy surface, catching the light like small crystals. Nathan moved very gently, each gesture purposeful but still relaxed. The sunlight shone on his tan skin, making it hard for Megan not to notice. She quickly ducked her head, scolding herself. "Concentrate on the roses," she whispered, clutching the pruning shears. But despite her resolve, her eyes betrayed her, glancing back at him. Before she noticed, Nathan was standing closer. "What are you doing?" His voice broke the silence, making her startled. Megan looked up, her heart beating fast. "Oh, just pruning the roses," she said, her voice uneven. "They need a little extra care this time of year." Nathan smiled faintly, his eyes lingering on her a little longer than she expected. "You're great. The garden looks great." "Thank you," Megan replied, turning back to her work to try to hide her rosy cheeks. Nathan didn't move, his presence remained looming but unmistakable. "If you ever need help, you know where to find me," he said gently before getting back in the car. As she watched him go, Megan's hand trembled slightly. She tried to focus on the roses again, but the weight of his gaze remained, as if it had left an imprint on her very soul. The house becomes quieter than usual when Chirabi goes away on business. That evening, Megan sat on the living room sofa, trying to concentrate on a movie playing on TV. But the cheerful voices and bright colors on the screen did little to distract her. Her thoughts were like a whirlwind, swaying between guilt, confusion, and something she dared not name. Faint footsteps drew her attention toward the door. Nathan appeared, his body gently illuminated by the warm light from the hallway. "You still awake?" he asked, his voice quiet and calm. Megan nodded, her hand caressing the corner of her knee. "I couldn't sleep." "What about you?" Nathan entered the room and sat down on the sofa opposite her, closer than she expected. He leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, as if he were searching her face for an answer that she wasn't ready to give. "I was thinking," he began, his voice tinged with hesitation. "Sometimes there are things that you know you shouldn't feel, but you still feel them." Megan's breath hitched, her fingers tightening on the pillow. "What are you trying to say?" she asked, her voice near a whisper. Nathan leaned forward, placing his elbows on his knees. His gaze did not waver, locking onto hers with an intensity that made her pulse beat faster. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his words breaking the silence like a bolt of lightning. Megan stiffened, her mind racing for answers. "Nathan, this isn't right," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I know," he replied, his voice soft but unwavering. "But sometimes, the wrong thing is the only thing that feels alive." The silence that followed was suffocating, filled with unspoken emotions that neither of them could deny. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier as the days passed. Chirabi was still away, leaving Megan and Nathan alone under the same roof. Moments that had once been ordinary now became tense, every glance, every accidental touch, every shared silence. One morning, Megan found herself in the kitchen, making coffee as the sun streamed through the window. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air, but her mind was far from calm. She heard light footsteps behind her, and knew it was Nathan without turning around. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice soft. "You look tired." Megan shook her head, concentrating on pouring the coffee into her cup. "I'm fine," she replied curtly, though her hands were shaking slightly. Nathan moved closer, placing his hand lightly on the counter beside her. The warmth of his presence made it impossible for her to ignore him. "No, you're not," he whispered, his eyes searching hers. Before she could react, the sound of something being placed on the table caught her attention. She turned and saw a small white envelope lying there, unmarked, plain, and ominous. Her chest tightened as she picked it up, her fingers trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short, cold message. "I know everything." Megan held her breath. Her eyes turned to Nathan, who was watching her with quiet concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice even but tinged with curiosity. Megan forced a weak smile, tucking the paper behind her back. "Just a little tired," she said. But the words on the paper rang in her mind like an alarm. Someone knew. Someone had seen them. The question now was, who? And what would they do next? The day Chirabi returned home, everything had changed. Megan hadn't expected him until the weekend, but the sound of his car pulling into the driveway had jolted her from her thoughts. She rushed into the living room, her heart pounding. When the door opened, Chirabi entered, looking unusually familiar. He held a large brown envelope in his hand, his expression sharp and unreadable. "Megan," he said, his voice even but cold. "Explain this." He tossed the envelope onto the table. The contents spilled out, photos, notes, and a message that made Megan's stomach clench. Every image, every word pointed to the truth she had tried to bury. "Chirabi, it's not what you think," Megan stammered, her voice shaking. "It's not what I think." His voice rose, mixed with anger and pain. "You and my son? How could you?" Before Megan could reply, Nathan appeared in the hallway, his expression calm but resolute. "It's not her fault," he said. "This is my fault. I take full responsibility." "Shut up!" Chirabi roared, clenching his fists. He turned to Nathan, his eyes blazing. "I brought you into my home. I treated you like family. And this is how you repay me?" Nathan stood his ground, his expression unreadable. Chirabi pointed to the door. "Pack up and get out. Now." Megan's tears streamed down her face as Nathan quietly gathered his belongings. She wanted to say something, anything to stop him, but her voice failed her. As Nathan's car disappeared down the road, Megan felt the weight of what they'd done crash over her. The house, once a haven, now feels suffocating. And Chirabi, her husband, her anchor, looked at her as if she were a stranger. The silence that followed was more damning than any words could ever be. After Nathan left, the house was filled with an eerie silence. Chirabi didn't say a word to Megan. He locked himself in his office, emerging only when necessary, his presence cold and distant. Megan was left to wander the empty halls, haunted by memories of what had been and what had been lost. A few days later, Chirabi filed for divorce. He moved into a hotel, leaving Megan behind in the house that now feels more like a hollow shell than a home. The whispers of neighbors soon followed. People who once greeted her warmly now offered cold smiles or avoided her altogether. Megan endured the judgmental glances and the sharp edges of gossip that seemed to slice through her wherever she went. But the hardest part was the emptiness. Every corner of the house reminds her of Nathan, the fleeting touches, the stolen glances, and the moments that felt so real but were now only shadows. One morning, as she sat with a cold cup of coffee, the sound of something slipping through the door caught her attention. A white envelope lay on the floor, unmarked except for her name written in Nathan's familiar handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a small note. "Sorry for everything. One day I'll come back to you." Megan stared at the words, her emotions tangled between pain and longing. For the first time in weeks, a fragile smile crept across her face. She realized she couldn't change the past, but she could start again. Megan threw herself into her garden, took art classes, and sought joy in the small things. One day, as she pruned her roses, the doorbell rang. Her heart skipped a beat. Another envelope waiting for her, with a simple question inside. "Are you ready?" Megan smiled, feeling warm return to her heart. The days turned into weeks, and the life Megan once knew slipped further from her grasp. Chirabi's absence became permanent, and with Nathan gone as well, the house felt unbearably empty. Every whisper from the neighbors and every stolen glance in the street reminded her of the mistakes she had made, the boundaries she had crossed. But from the wreckage, Megan found a quiet strength. She started to rebuild, not just the house she lived in, but the life she wanted to live. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the simple beauty of blooming roses and the soothing rhythm of her work. Art classes gave her a creative outlet, a way to express the emotions she could no longer put into words. Slowly, The harsh judgment from those around her began to matter less, as she focused inward. Yet, no amount of growth could erase Nathan from her thoughts. His note lingered in her mind. "One day, I'll come back for you." She wasn't sure if she hoped for that day or feared it, but she knew she wasn't ready to face it just yet. One quiet afternoon, as Megan trimmed a perfect red rose, the doorbell rang. Her heart fluttered, a familiar sensation she thought she had buried. When she opened the door, another white envelope waited for her. Inside, the words were simple, yet they sent a shiver through her. "I kept my promise. Are you ready?" Megan stood there for a long moment, the sunlight warming her face. She smiled, though her eyes brimmed with tears. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she had changed. She wasn't the same woman who had been caught in the whirlwind of forbidden desire. She was stronger now. And this time, she was ready.